Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Eileen, Vanessa, Margie, thank you for attending this presentation of the Frontera Art discussion, a part of the Humanities Collaborative at El Paso Community College and the University of Texas at El Paso. My name is Mauricio Rodríguez, and I will be presenting along with my research assistant, Vanessa Zuniga. So a quick introduction. I am a professor of Chicanic Studies at El Paso Community College, Valle Verde campus. I've been teaching at the college level for over 2 decades now, first starting off at UTEP and presently at the El Paso Community College, Valle Verde campus for the last approximately 20 years as well. My interest in this project is obviously directly tied to that discipline. I also forgot to mention, I do teach in the English department as well. The connection to the work and the project, I think, are very germane, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. So Vanessa, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am currently a undergraduate student at UTEP. I'm majoring in English and American literature and minoring in anthropology. This is my second year with the collaborative. I don't know what else. I guess that's pretty good. That's good enough.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more once we start talking about the research on the specific backgrounds that we brought to the material. That way we can share a little bit about your journey, your experience, and first reading all of the critical criticism, all the scholarly work surrounding the artwork that we have examined and we'll be talking about today. So we'll take that opportunity to then talk about what you learned, what you liked, what you didn't like, and then obviously make connections to where we are today, especially in your coursework as well, because I think most people are really interested in to see how students are reacting to doing research, especially at this level. Okay, so let me jump to the next screen here. Okay, so background and purpose of this project as we initially conceptualized it. My biggest interest was in talking about the production of art from this unique place where we reside, where we work, we live, where we experience so much as a result of our geographic location and isolation. Something that is produced from this area is unique in the sense that there's no other area like El Paso, Juarez, Las Cruces, geographically, politically, what's the term I'm looking at here when we talk about a social sensibility? Well, I guess that's just it, right? Because we are at the basin of a bowl surrounded by mountains, we are physically isolated from other major complex areas. And so that physical distance, but also the history of this region informs the aesthetic that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And part of the interest that I have in sharing that aesthetic and sharing that sensibility with others as well. So we first started the project in about a year ago, trying to look at various artists and resulting in the 2 artists that we're going to be talking about today, out of this desire to share with others that unique work that's coming out of here. We often hear about the border region discussed in the media, sometimes in academic spaces as well, in ways that are not really accurate or that are missing kind of not just the nuances, but the larger details that should matter to us. This is our home. We work from here and we appreciate a lot of the nuances, and we can get into various discussions about those nuances. But I think what this project initially started off with in terms of the importance of well, the idea was to share the origin of the work, the influences, and why it should matter to people outside of this region. Yes, there are other artists that are working in the same genres and producing work that is very similar in the social political scope. However, because we are situated where we are now, the message that this work presents is very distinct. And so I would ask y'all to then maybe consider similar regions along the southern US, northern Mexico border, such as Tijuana, San Diego, even McAllen, Brownsville, Laredo. Those areas, even though they are border communities, they don't have the size, they don't have the history that we have here. And so that does influence the work and the messages that we are presenting. And especially now post 2016-2020 period, we're now starting to see the production of a lot of art coming out of that period that now reflects a lot of these experiences, not just from our specific area, but from other border regions as well. We'll be looking at two specific artists, Francisco Delgado and Mauricio Sánchez. And we kind of landed on them, one in working with or trying or attempting to contact other artists as well, but having garnered a relationship with them and having had access to so much of their work and just looking at the complexity and the scope of their creations, we ended up focusing on those two artists. And the work that they do is not limited to one genre. They are practitioners of multiple types of graphic art. And so we'll be looking at some of those differences today as well. Ultimately, the goal is to share this work again with the community, with the people who are interested in this presentation today, but also to express how, well, important it is that we appreciate this work, that we understand the artist's motivation in sharing their work. Part of what they do is an effort to allow everyone access. And when we start talking about access, we might talk a little bit about museums. I'll talk a little bit about the issue of Eurocentrism and the idea of art and how we envision or how we think about art as well. So the connections that we have to make then to the humanities art, obviously the graphic art that we're looking at has a natural connection to the humanities, but is the content, it is the message that's contained in the work of these artists that I think speaks to the entire overarching umbrella humanities kind of a, well, I guess arena to talk about all things related, not just the graphic arts. And I think we're waiting for other people to come in. Let me stop sharing here. Well, let me see if I can do this without ruining the connection. I think I have to stop share, so bear with me. Okay, welcome to everyone I just let in. We're already in the middle of the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and go back to that shared screen. Okay, if all the new attendees, if you would do me a favor and mute your microphones, please. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the research aspect of this project, the historical, political, and social context for Chicanx or Frontera Art. And Vanessa, so let's go ahead and segue to your research, your learning discussion of, well, all things Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, which and we're not going to get into the definition of those terms. That's another presentation altogether, but hopefully everyone understands what we mean when we use this terminology. So Vanessa.
So I definitely came into this project very, I guess blindly is the best word I could use to describe it. I'd never taken any Chicano classes, Chicano studies classes, nor any art classes. So all of this was very much a big learning experience for me. Starting with these two, they really helped me, well, with these 3 books, the second one is 2 volumes. They really helped me understand the overall movement from the very beginning, early stages in the 1800s, all the way up until present day. And then the art, it's really powerful. Not only are you seeing images from like here in the border, you're also seeing them from other places, but also I think it's important to recognize the religious symbols and imagery that is found throughout Chicano and Chicana art, as well as it's very, I think, political, and it helps, I think it definitely helps people understand where the movement is coming from, which I think is the point of all art. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about the movement as you learned and read about in the book Chicano, the History of Mexican American Civil Rights Movement? Because there's always, and I found in my classes with a lot of my students, there's a confusion with certain social political figures, historical figures, and the confluence of 2 movements that were happening simultaneously and did affect the same people simultaneously, but were 2 very distinct movements. And referring to the actual Chicano movement, which was an educational rights movement, of course, starting in the K through 12 system, representation, access to tax-funded resources in public schooling. So it was educational in its heart and its essence, but the confusion with a lot of people happens to be or lie in another movement that was happening at the exact same time, which was the farm worker labor rights movement, which was headed by Dolores Huerta and her partner, Cesar Chavez, which is always kind of a shock for people to learn that, you know, Chavez never identified as Chicano. In fact, he was adamantly working against many of the members of the Chicano movement, the educational movement, because again, 2 very distinct movements happening at the same time, affecting much of the same groups of people. But can you speak a little bit about that, Vanessa?
Sorry, I'm trying to find a starting point.
No worries. In your blog, you mentioned kind of a coalescence of understanding happening right around the founding of Texas, right? The Republic, and that was a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Can you talk a little bit about that, which is a really good point to start talking about in terms of identity and just people recognizing, hey, you know, there's these people here and they're contributors to the entire history of a nation.
Right. Yeah. I think that part really stood out to me just because it started so early in like the founding of the United States, I guess you could say, and the development of these borders. It was definitely interesting to see that a lot of the Mexicans who were now finding themselves living in this American territory found themselves not only not welcomed by the American people that were moving south because it was new land for America, but also being rejected by the people from Mexico as well, because the people from Mexico felt that they had abandoned them as well.
And that's
And, go ahead.
that we kind of deal with, right? That as I think it's Alicia Gaspar de Alba talks about in her essay Literary Wetback, this idea of cultural schizophrenia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This idea that we're not from here, we're not from there, we're not Mexican enough, we're not American enough, ni de aquí, ni de allá, is kind of a common phrase that we use to talk about this conflict or this crisis of identity. And of course, yeah, we get governments involved and we start moving borders, like you were talking about, right, in your blog. It confuses everyone and kind of, well, it's exhausting at the same time, right?
Yeah, and I think identity today is still something that many Chicanos or Mexicanos or Mexican Americans, just people living in this area still struggle with, just because we don't necessarily know our entire roots. A lot of what I saw in, which one is it? Well, I guess both Borderlands and Inside Outside the Master's House, I really noticed that, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought.
On identity?
Yes. Oh my gosh, I totally lost it. It's gone.
No worries.
Give me 1 second.
What are you thinking about? I just want to remind you, if you have a question or if you want to type something up as a comment, use the chat feature. I have an assistant here who will be whispering questions at me. So if you have questions for Vanessa or for me or just in general, a comment in general, go ahead and post that in the chat and we'll definitely relay that here during the discussion.
Okay, I got it. I got my point back. I was thinking of like the native culture that was really present here in the early years. And so I think a lot of what's mentioned in both of those books is that mixing of both those cultures, of the Mexican culture and of the native culture, using natural remedies and such. And just spirituality as a whole is really prominent in especially a lot of the artwork as well as the literature.
It's something that a lot of critics found controversial, right, Vanessa? This idea of the depictions of certain imagery, even though it wasn't political in nature, what I think you and I both discovered is a lot of the criticism surrounding Chicanx art it's coming from obviously a body of critics who are mostly white, mostly male, and obviously they're bringing their own inherent biases to the discussion of this art. And usually, you know, the first thing to be mentioned is the level of politicalness, right, that's being depicted, talking about the content, the imagery in the image or, you know, the graphic display that we're witnessing. But even when it's not political, there's been criticisms of such things that are considered to be indigenous. There are these certain key phrases that are used to describe things that are not of Western cultural mindsets or what these white male critics think should be depicted in artwork. And this is where I think you and I started learning a little bit more about the level of Eurocentrism, not necessarily in the production of the work that we've been looking at, but in how others talk about that production, which is, again, part of the major scope of this project is to redirect the narrative. This work needs to be talked about from within, not from without, not looking from the outside, as Alicia Gaspar de Alba talks about, not looking at it from the outside, but looking at it from the inside. And her book speaks, you know, extensively about that issue. When we look at some of these images, and we'll be cycling through these sites here in a second, after we listen to the interviews by the artist Delgado and Sánchez, but we'll be looking at some of the details in the images and what some critics have focused on and have used as a method to isolate, segregate this body of work, to not include it in an overall American discussion of art production, which is not unique to just graphic artists, but also to artists of letters, talking about writers. So, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I know, Vanessa, you're really excited to make connections between writing and art, obviously both um, graphic art, that is, both are art forms. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. Let me go ahead, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to start the video clip of Marco Sanchez, I believe we're going to lead with here. And before I do that, were there any chat questions or comments so far? No? Okay. So we have created a web page. And so this will be in a link at the end of the presentation. It's fronteraartwork.com. And so the presentation will be posted in this, and I'm not sharing my screen, am I? I'm not. I should probably share my screen. Where am I? Okay, share the screen as I stop sharing the PowerPoint. Okay, so audience, you now see the web page. Okay, so this is the web page, audience. Fronteraartwork.com. So that was the domain name that was available. And this features the video clips, some of the key images, and also this entire presentation. So for future reference, if you want to access this, this is open and available to the public. It's a relatively young website, so I don't think any of the bots out there on the interwebs have picked it up, but you can find it from fronteraartwork.com. And as soon as the bots get in line, then just keyword searches, Marco Sanchez, Francisco Delgado, so on. We also uploaded the videos to YouTube. So I think that is Sanchez. Okay, so I want to start this video here. And I'm hoping y'all should get the sound. So you're gonna hear me talking. I'm gonna ask for confirmation of sound on the audience end here.
He was an anthropologist and archaeologist, and he's from Texas, somewhere in the valley. I don't remember if it's like Laredo or McAllen, or it's that area. And the book is, I don't want to misspeak and misquote, but I believe it's the first like actual book written in a with a very scientific approach, both archaeologically and anthropologically, the way that they catalog findings in the desert, and a lot of it was, shoes. He also had an installation. He's had multiple installations in museums where he they gather certain materials and equipment and clothing accessories that migrants carry with them in their pilgrimage across primarily the Sonoran Desert, which is the only part of the border that isn't militarized because of the extreme temperatures. And he's created several installations, and many artists have done this with shoes, and we've seen it like with Red Woman's shoes, but his just sort of struck different because it hits home. It's stuff that we see here all the time, and it's stuff that we might know people that went through that process, through that pilgrimage, whether it's crossing in the desert or through tunnels or another way. And that is partly the reason why I did that piece, Without a Shoe, just from reading that book and find.
I just realized I queued it at the wrong time marker. My apologies, folks. That is Marco Sanchez. He was talking about some of the found items and how he's used that imagery in some of his other work. But here's the actual clip that I wanted you all to watch.
Influence. One of the questions was influence. One of the questions was, what were some of your formal, I guess, influencers or your motivations to taking this on as a profession? Obviously, your grandfather is a very, very important part of this discussion, but what can you share with us about that?
Okay. So yeah, after, you know, my grandfather, I decided to research both El Paso, UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso, and New Mexico State University in Las Cruces. And I went and checked out both studios, and I wanted to do painting because of my grandfather, and I wanted to do anthropology. So I actually started as a painting and anthropology major.
What was your grandfather's name?
Guillermo Cordero. And I wanted to do anthropology because I figured, hell, like I've been traveling and I've been backpacking quite a bit, and I love learning about cultures, both the physical aspect and the cultural aspect of it, and the artistic process that comes with it too, like their music and how music's evolved both there and here, and how we've all been influenced by different regions and different people. And I don't know, I didn't see much from Las Cruces, New Mexico, from NMSU, that I don't know, I wasn't too thrilled, or it was more conceptual work. And my work has always been more figurative and more representational, that I saw that at UTEP and I said, no, you know, this is where I'll go. And then I had one painting professor, and his name was Jim Quinnen. I only had him for one semester, and then he left. And then in came Francisco Delgado, who I had throughout most of my painting career there, except for my last painting course. But he was a big, huge influence on my work after that, and always in my ear. And I loved the work that he was doing, and just saw the Chicano work. And I always thought Chicano work was sort of different, but there was a lot more narrative than, I guess, the traditional, what we normally think of, like Mexican work or Chicano work, or like luchadores and this and that. Yes, he does paint a lot of those, or Villa or Zapata, you know, or Frida Kahlo. And he'll paint some of those figures, but there's so much more to them. They're involved in social issues, and they're wrestling with the Statue of Liberty, and then Porky the Pig, and just, you know, it just kind of threw me to, I didn't know exactly what to think of it, because when I did start my formal education, I wasn't aware of a lot of the artwork and a lot of the contemporary artists. I thought art was, you know, Frida Kahlo and the Da Vinci's and the Picassos and the Van Gogh, what's more popular, I guess, the artists that are more known. But then there's just so much more, so many artists that aren't as known, or contemporaries. Unfortunately, that's changed because of social medias as well, and just being able to, like you said, cold call somebody instead of having to go to a gallery and trying to find out who's representing this artist, which I don't want to do that. I'd never want to do that. So Francisco Delgado was a big one. He was like my first big influence after my grandfather. Of course, this was when I was a painting and an anthropology major. And then I came and I took printmaking, my first print course, and I had heard some of these terms because of my grandfather, but never really understood. You know, it's just said, yeah, oh yeah, of course, yes. You know, okay, yeah. And it wasn't until I got to touch a copper plate and make it an entire mess. It was, what the hell was I doing? I believe my first copper plate, my first etching was it was a beaver skull that I had, a beaver skull. So I was like, okay, you know, beaver skull. But then doing lithography and doing relief prints and doing screen printing, and it just blew my mind, and it just kind of put painting on the back burner. And my professor for that was Kim Bauer, and again, second biggest influence in my life after my grandfather. First would be Francisco, and then Kim Bauer. And then, you know, just learning more and researching more, I came across, the further I dove into printmaking, I came across a lot of the Mexican artists, primarily like the artists that Leopoldo Mendez, who was one of the founders of Taller de Gráfica Popular in Mexico in 1937. And he is by far, I would like to say, probably my favorite printmaker, followed by Albert Dürer. But just his line work and his sensibilities and the storytelling, his narratives behind his work were beautiful. And he was highlighting a lot of the atrocities that happened throughout the Mexican Revolution. So they're very striking images. And I remember briefly like seeing them around. I don't exactly remember where, but Leopoldo Mendez definitely shifted my perspective and also my narratives. Leopoldo Mendez, along with the political climate that we were going through 4 years ago until today, 4 or 5 years ago until today.
Can you talk a little bit in detail about that?
So just as an aside here, is my face on the screen? Yes, okay, good. The footage that was shot for the Marco Sánchez interview is about 2 hours long. It's raw footage, unedited. In fact, towards the end of the footage, you'll see I disappear. It's because my battery died. But it's fully viewable in its raw form, unedited on the website, again, from fronteraartwork.com. So if you want to check out that entire conversation, it goes into a lot of detail about well, his work, our relationship. And I just want to mention something really quickly, because the way I contacted Marco Sánchez and Francisco Delgado was literally throwing a rock in the dark. I cold called them, I emailed them completely out of the blue. We didn't know of each other, and they both responded. That's how our relationship started. And that's how I came to know both of them. First as artists, second as professionals, but now I'm very privileged to call them friends. I want to share another clip from the interview with Francisco Delgado, where he talks about his influences. And that raw footage, which is also available to the website, is a little over an hour. So I tried to kind of condense the conversation and not talk as much, which those of you who know me, you do know that I can talk ad nauseum. So the second clip with Francisco was a lot shorter. So let me go ahead and close one of these screens here. Let me go back to my share. Need to find my, there we go. Let me make sure I'm queued at the right place. But that between your aesthetic and your influences aesthetics?
Well, I think, you know, for sure influences, you know, we can go back to a lot of, you know, Mesoamerican art. There's a little bit of like, you know, Mayan kind of aesthetic to, you know, to the work, especially the early work, you know, the painting that you have behind you, you know, sort of the, you know, the stylization of like the faces, depicting of those faces. It's part of it. But after that, you know, I have the Tres Grandes, you know, the muralistas Siqueiros, Orozco, and Rivera have been a, you know, great influence in the work. Other, you know, Chicano artist Malaquias has been also very influential, and I go to other, you know, to other areas where, you know, Max Beckman has been one of the persons that I really look up to, or looked up to, you know, when I was sort of in my formal education. You know, the way he would depict spaces, composition was really important. Others have that have influenced would be Guillermo Gomez Peña, Coco Fusco, like those those artists have been, you know, their art performances are very direct. And when I saw that for the first time, I was like, wow, like they're not afraid. They're not, you know, they're not afraid to really speak their mind. They're not, you know, they're not afraid to act who they, you know, who they are. Not, they're not afraid to have an accent, and still be important, still be like, you know, powerful. So those were my influences. Others, you know, Luis Jimenez, you know, local or national artist. You know, I sort of just studied his style of drawing, you know, when I was at UTEP. I mean, there's been many. You know, my mother was also um, another big influence. You know, single parent. You know, just going through the struggle. I think she was one of the biggest influences as well.
Yeah, going back to that labor motif that you capture in so much of your work. And again, this is all connected to your identity and how that's depicted. One of the questions uses a term which we're not going to define here on this video because, again, I want the audience members to also do their own work. But I identify as a Chicano, and the question that I presented to you is asking you whether or not you identify as Chicano. If yes, if you explain a little bit about that identity, how that factors into your art, does it affect your art in very specific ways? And again, the politics that are contained in your work. And I guess this is me projecting my, my views of the world onto, what you're doing. But to me, it's everything that I have used to formulate my understanding and to hopefully use to explain to others what my identity means. So
going through the journey of finding identity, I at the beginning, I coming from Juarez and everything, that I kind of sort of identified myself as Mexicano. I was like a Mexicano fronterizo, and whenever I heard the term Chicano, I always associated with something that was negative, like a pocho or something. I was like, I don't want to be that. And I think as I read more, as I sort of became more aware of my surroundings, I sort of started understanding, what the term meant. At graduate school, Maceo and Malaquias Montoya were very influential in teaching me about Chicanismo and what it is. And once I started actually internalizing everything that was said, my experience, I was like, you know what, I am a Chicano. Even though I wasn't born in this country, I am all those things. I'm part of that struggle. I benefit from that struggle. And even like reading Guillermo Gomez Peña, that he's from Mexico City, but he says that he's always in the process of what do you call? He calls it, I guess, becoming a Chicano. It's always part of the process. So I am everything that everything that I experience. I am a fronterizo. I'm a Mexicano. I am a Chicano. And ultimately, I call myself a bordeño, person from the border that has everything that encompasses, those political terms. That's basically who I am. So I embrace that term, dearly. I because I feel like I am, again, like part of that struggle.
of course, I always forget to unmute myself. I said I'm going to stop sharing that screen and go back to the presentation here. So we last left off before we started the video clips. Vanessa was talking about her journey in learning all things Chicanx, Chicana, Chicano, and going through these different texts. And so Vanessa had spent a lot of time. One of the homework assignments I gave her was to read Jacinto's book on Mexican American art, which is essentially the breakout book that then starts looking at this body of work critically from an insider's view, not an outsider's view, looking into us. But he explains these concepts that we're not going to get into in the discussion of the actual pieces themselves. And so I think Vanessa, in her studying in the background and learning about all these issues, she then chose to talk about I think the first piece we're going to look at is a piece by Marco Sánchez entitled Heads or Tails, Un Volado en la Línea. So I'm hoping y'all can see the images here. Vanessa, would you like to start us off talking about this piece?
You still haven't shared the PowerPoint, but I will definitely start, yes.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Can you not see the PowerPoint?
No.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, I think you have to stop sharing the YouTube and then start sharing again the PowerPoint.
Okay. Jorge or Vanessa, can you confirm you can see that?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So like I said earlier, or most of you joined, I've never taken an art class, so I'm kind of not, I wouldn't say that I know a lot about what I'm saying. But I do like looking at the symbolism of dreams. And so when I was looking at these images, I kind of connected the symbolism to dreams and kind of tried to see how it worked. So in looking at this one, right away I noticed that he's kind of falling backwards. And when I found when you're dreaming that you're falling backwards, it's that you have prevented yourself from making a bad decision or mistake. And in this sense, he's now on the American side of the wall. So he prevented himself from staying in a situation that was harmful for himself, is how I saw it. And then dreaming in black and white also symbolizes that your lack of emotional participation. So I kind of feel like a lot of people aren't necessarily taking this voyage and trying to migrate to the United States just because it's something that they want to do. It's something that they need to do for themselves and for their families. Yeah, that's what I had to say about that one.
Well, no, that's a great interpretation. And just to explain a couple of details that you see here in the text. So this piece, it's a fairly large piece, 22.5 by 32.5, and that's based on standard sheet sizes of paper that a lot of printmakers use. So that kind of explains that detail. But Marco used a woodcut technique. So the wall, the shadows here, the image of Mount Cristo Rey. If any of you who are familiar with this area of our region, so Mount Cristo Rey borders a colonia named Anapra, which is separated by the 20-foot brown monstrosity that we all know about. So the way Marco captured that image is in first cutting the background on wood, and I think it's called masonite wood. And the image of himself, this is actually a cutout of a solid piece of flat copper, which he then hand scribed and then put through a different process. So this is actually two different processes on the same sheet of paper, which complicates the work even more so because of your workspace, the cleanliness, and the transfer, and just the quality. So what he's doing on a technical scale is, in and of itself, amazing and noteworthy. Something that you don't often see. And the image here, unfortunately, the photography doesn't capture the embossment or embossing of the copper plate, but if you were to look at this print live in person, you can see the image of Marco actually recessed into the paper, which kind of gives it another level of expression and kind of that surreal nature that Vanessa was talking about. Let's jump to the next one. I think I'm talking about this next one. This is one of my favorites, La Patrona, again by Marco. And this is another example of him using varied techniques of printmaking. So this is also a cutting, but it's done on linoleum. And so on the background, we see this kind of stylistic or stylized image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, who we often refer to as La Patrona, which I'm not going to translate. I'll let the audience do the work in case they don't know what that means. And of course, she is overseeing this other image, which is another copper plate embossed image, but this takes it even further. So we have the backdrop again on 22 by 32 sheet of paper. We have the stylized image of this religious icon, which I know Vanessa can talk about a little bit about as she likes. But she's overseeing this woman down here who has been featured in actually a lot of international articles and documentary features. Her name is Norma Romero Vasquez, and she's from a town in Veracruz called La Patrona. And she had taken it upon herself to organize a group of people to help out the travelers. So these are people who are coming from the southern region of Mexico, crossing into the southern region of Mexico from Central and Southern American countries into the country of Mexico, and then attempting to travel across to the northern border with the United States. These travelers, these mostly asylum seekers, which of course, we should all know about from being in the news for several years, are often abused by people that we would think would share their interest or their struggle, but they do undergo a lot of turmoil. Most of them move from the southern region to the northern region via rail car. They jump these cars and they try to survive their journey. Oftentimes this journey takes on average about 30 days is what we understand in talking to a lot of these asylum seekers. But this image resonates with me for several reasons. There, of course, is the cultural, spiritual connection to the Catholic religion. I consider myself to be a Guadalupano, so all images that incorporate the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe are really strong to me. The term patrona is revering the female figure. The fact that we all know, if you know, then you know, that in a brown household, the person who runs the family, the person who controls the politics, the learning within the household is usually the matriarch. And again, that resonates with me. So the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe reminds me of my own mother. But so does this image, the copper etching down here of Norma, because she's in repose, she's tired, which is kind of also a play, and I talked to Marco a little bit about this, on Michelangelo's La Beata, except obviously the roles are kind of reversed here in that it's a female that is now being protected by the mother, which I found very endearing. This is a piece that we're lucky enough to live with. I have not had it mounted yet, which is one of the things I constantly apologize to Marcos about. We need to get his work on display. But this image, because of what it says, where it's saying it from, the fact that we are now opening our eyes, not just to our Mexican compatriots, our Mexican community members, but also people from south of Mexico who are then traveling, these long distances over long periods of time, suffering all sorts of injustices and often the victims of violent, horrible crimes, just to arrive at our border, which has become extremely politicized, as we all know about, and endure another levels and series of abuses. So I can talk a little bit more about this, but let's move on to the next image, which is Migración Protegida. And this is another powerful piece that Vanessa is going to talk about.
So again, I obviously looked at this like a dream. So in the background, there's the bull with what I think is a KKK member who's being like flipped over. And to dream that you are being chased by a black bull implies that you are refusing to acknowledge your own stubbornness. And that's really interesting considering that it's a member of the KKK. They're so stuck in their ways, and they have this mindset that they're not willing to change and be accepting of other people. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then butterflies, there's obviously a lot of monarch butterflies which symbolize, which migrate, so obviously the migration imagery. And then also to see a butterfly in your dream signifies that you are experiencing a new way of thinking. And I think that's kind of like what happens when these migrant people arrive to the US or to the border. Their mindset kind of has to change, and they have to kind of look at things differently and kind of try to figure out a different way to go about things in some cases. And that you are also going under some sort of transformation as well. And then also the position with regard to the fence also just kind of symbolizes the freedom aspect of what's going on, because a lot of cases they're leaving their homes because it's dangerous to even be there for gangs or other reasons.
Amazing, Vanessa, the fact that you picked up on some details that most viewers would not be privy to, because in order to know the influence behind this particular piece, you'd have to speak to Mauricio Sánchez himself. But we talked about this transformation, this journey, talking about the image of the young man in this piece. He is transforming, just like the butterflies, right? They, as you mentioned, the butterflies are going to metamorphosis, and so is this young man. This young man happens to be the brother of the artist, Mauricio Sánchez. And his fight, his struggle, as you talk about, is a very real one. This is a man who joined the United States Marine Corps, completed his basic training, and served with honor. But at the end of his service, he went through another struggle, and that was in coming out to his family and what that meant in terms of how he was viewed. He went from being a boy to a man coming out of the Marine Corps, and then back to being a boy once he came out to his family. And so unless you know the artist personally, you wouldn't know those details, but I think you did a beautiful job in reading this imagery, Vanessa. I'm going to move on to the next piece here. And we're now going to start talking about Francisco Delgado's work. So this is a lithograph, which to explain, this is actually carved into, and I hope that the audience can maybe visualize this. This is carved into a massive slab of limestone. So it's a big flat rock. And so all of those values, all that what looks like line work is actually the result of him chiseling, scribing into the stone, treating the stone through various processes and preparing it for these prints. And so this piece entitled American Graffiti, White Elephant is another gorgeous piece. I didn't put the size on here, but this is, I think it's a 20 by 24 inch print, which is a little bit smaller than the others. But I like this piece particularly because of what it says about me, my community, and how our community is viewed. So we have this lithograph depicting at its center an old, I believe it's a 1973, 1974 Ford F-150. As I was talking about this piece with the artist in the interview, and if y'all want to hear that discussion, just I forgot what the timestamp is, but you can find more information about it. I was telling how my neighbor actually owns this truck or a variation of this truck and is parked outside. So I get to see it on a daily basis, but I also get to see this particular piece of work. When I first witnessed this in person, it was years ago, and it reminded me of my father. So this man walking along the sidewalk, and if you look at his legs are cut off right beneath the knees. At first, I kind of thought they were melting in the sidewalk, but he explained, no, they're actually been his legs have been cut off, amputated. If you want to say, which is a discussion of how our laborers are basically prevented from any real progress. The man driving the truck is another depiction of a laborer, and he's a cartonero, which is a person who goes around to various businesses along their back of the businesses and collects discarded cardboard. And so these cartoneros, they stack the cardboard in the back of their trucks. And if you've ever been behind one of these trucks, these stacks are, I kid you not, anywhere between 10 to 12 feet high, extremely heavy, and very precariously secured to the beds of these trucks using sometimes just twine or some very thin looking rope. And it's kind of like a weird thing to be stuck behind one in traffic, because you're hoping the wind doesn't catch them and blow them all over you. But they do this to resell, to recycle the work. And they're not doing it to be green. They're doing this as a method to survive, a method to make ends meet. And why do they do this? Well, because of a lack of opportunity. The fact that most of our laborers in this region don't have the luxury, the protections of most other workers, say in a corporate environment, where they have medical care, where they have legal protection, where they're not the victims of wage theft. But a lot of our laborers understand and can relate to the fact that their work is often not just underpaid, but sometimes actually stolen from them by their employers. So this piece, aside from being just a gorgeous representation of lithography in two different tints, by the way, carries with it a lot of personal and social significance. And again, people looking at this may not understand, well, what's the deal with the elephants? Well, the elephant is the obvious problem with how we compensate labor. In my interview with Francisco, we do talk about honoring artists, and by honoring, I use that as kind of a code word to talk about pay. We need to pay artists for their work because it is labor. We need to stop treating them like their actual time is a donation. And if you're an artist, if you're a writer, if you're a graphic artist, if you work in sculpture, you know that your time is the most valuable thing. It's not just the materials, which are also very expensive, but your time is what needs to be honored. It needs to be compensated. The next piece is another piece by Delgado. And this one is just chock full of, symbolism, metaphor. So the baseball cap, which is obviously a representation of a black widow, features, and you can't really see the luminescence in this image because the vibrancy is really, really amazing to witness it firsthand live in person. This is a 4-color relief print of the political issue of ICE, the Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement Agency, which is under the larger umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security, and what it is that we deal with as residents here of the border. So we see the hands. One hand is attached to the web via handcuff. The other is trying to reach across, and it's encountering the barbed wire, obviously talking about our fence here. But we know the dangers of a black widow, right? Whenever we see them, we know they're there. We try to stay away from them for no other reason than you just don't want to interact with something that is essentially deadlier than you and that can act with impunity. I'm going to kind of skip here because we are running very short on time. This image, which I don't know if y'all noticed, was the backdrop to my face, but this is the full image. This image by Delgado, I first saw in, and I'm sorry, Vanessa, did I talk over you? Did you want to talk about this one?
No, I mean, you can go ahead. It's okay.
Well, no, you talk about this one because I want to hear your voice.
Okay. So this one I didn't necessarily use dreams. I just looked at the image itself and kind of picked out things from it that stood out. So right away, it's like the American culture. So the TV's on, he's in what I guess you could call the throne. And he's eating a hamburger and drinking a beer. And there's other people wearing luchador masks. And I thought that was interesting because I obviously you can't tell who they are, and so automatically I can assume that it's representative of migrant workers, and the idea that once they get here and they kind of, not to say that they lose their identity, but from a government standpoint, they do. And that's why I think that they're represented the way that they are here. And then also the pilgrim hat, just those ties to those ancestral roots and the way that colonizers treated Native people and people with darker skin tones than they had. And it's kind of represented here as well, I think.
And again, your analysis and your reading of the work is amazing. The anonymity of laborers. So we see the people working in inside the home and then outside the home, right, covered with these nondescript luchador mask. And luchador, translates to a wrestler, but it also has metaphorical meaning as well. If you are familiar at all with Mexican lucha libre, the masks are often ornately decorated. These masks, if you notice, are just black, they're kind of plain, but that also is a continuation of the anonymity of laborers. We don't see their faces, right? They're there, they're in our spaces, inside our homes and outside our homes, tending to us. But we don't see those laborers, and oftentimes laborers, are associated with immigration, right? We don't see those immigrant faces, but as you so keenly discussed, Vanessa, the pilgrim imagery there with the buckle shoes and the pilgrim hat, we do talk about those immigrants, right? The original people without authorization in this part of the world. So again, your analysis was spot on. This is, again, one of our favorite pieces. And by the way, this piece was gifted to me by my wife for one of my birthdays years and years ago, and it featured prominently in our home. And it's one of my favorite pieces by Francisco I first saw in 1998, talking about access at a small gallery downtown, which no longer exists. It's the Bridge Center for Contemporary Arts, which did feature a lot of our regional artists in many different genres. When I first saw this piece, I was in grad school, very, very poor, in other words, and I had no, understanding of what art was then, or how you even acquire art. But fast forward to the present, again, cold calling, reaching out to Francisco, us developing a relationship, and then us acquiring this piece. And so it's kind of come full circle. And now we get to live with these pieces. We are running a little bit over, and so I'm going to skip to the end of the presentation, just talking a little bit about how this project focus kind of turned into a discussion focusing on the importance of getting away from this Eurocentric idea of looking at arts, that the content can be overtly political, it can be subtly political. All things are political, as Antonio Gramsci said, to live is to take sides. But aside from the political nature of a lot of the images that we looked at, there's much more to it that you really have to understand from living within our region, from living within our own lives, in order to really get it. And Vanessa coming to this project without that extensive background, that training, because she's not studying for a degree or a minor in Chicanic studies, but she brought that lack of a paradigm, and then ran with it, and she got it, and she hit it right on the head. And I'll let her speak to, you know, her likes or dislikes, but that was essentially it. And so I think it was very successful in reaching that kind of a very fluid goal that we started off with. Vanessa, you want to talk a little bit about that change in idea or understanding of, you know, all things Chicano, and how you applied that to looking at art?
Yeah. Overall, I'm so grateful for like the way that I'm able to connect all of these different aspects of my interests to one another in order to better understand things. And I think that's something that the collaborative really strives to emphasize through these projects. Yeah, just the idea of like liberal arts degrees, and just how you shouldn't necessarily be focused on one specific field necessarily, but try to like learn as much about all these different fields and then be able to connect them with one another. And I just think it's so interesting to be able to do that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I have not been monitoring the chat. Does anybody have any questions they want to voice at this point? Or comments? Okay. Well, with that then, I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank my research assistant, Vanessa Zuniga, so much. Let me go ahead and stop sharing the PowerPoint. Oh, maybe I should not have stopped sharing. Hold on a sec. I have one more slide here. So if y'all want to quickly just jot these, well, that main link down. The main link, the fronteraartwork.com, does contain this PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't contain the recording yet. I need to upload that to the website after we're done with this. So it'll be available on the website, and I'll try to get that published for everyone's access later today. So again, thank you all for attending. It's been my pleasure. So again, this is Mauricio Rodríguez and Vanessa Zuniga for the Humanities Collaborative at El Paso Community College and University of Texas at El Paso. So thank you, everyone.